Cedarwood was a sleepy little town where life seemed to run at an almost boring pace. But for couple Ethan and Martha Bennett, owners of a traditional meat shop inherited from their family, every day was a silent struggle against failure. Sales were plummeting, the storefront was constantly vandalized by vegan activists, and their marriage was on the rocks. What no one could have imagined was that, on a seemingly ordinary night, an unexpected confrontation with a vegan activist would end in something so dark that it would change the Bennetts' lives forever. Ethan Bennett was a 45-year-old man, with brown hair already punctuated by grey strands. His face was marked by exhaustion, the result of years of trying to keep the family business running. He was practical and methodical, someone who rarely showed his emotions, but whose quiet determination was unshakable. His meat store, Bennett's Butcher Shop, was on Cedarwood's main street, a simple red brick building with a weathered wooden sign. For Ethan, the store was more than a job. It was a legacy. Martha Bennett, on the other hand, was more emotional. At age 42, his warm personality had been worn down by financial difficulties and the monotony of small-town life. He had bright blue eyes that seemed to carry a longing for better time. Martha was the heart of the store, serving customers with a practiced smile, even when inside she felt the weight of the accumulated bill. She dreamed of something beyond the stifling routine, but she never said it out loud for fear of hurting Ethan's pride. The store, which had once been the center of the community, now seemed a constant target for a group of vegan activists. Led by Kyle Roberts, a 25-year-old with an aggressive attitude and a blind passion for the cause, the group made the Bennetts' lives hell. They organized weekly protests, always on Saturday mornings when the store received more customers. "Assassins!" shouted the activists, holding posters with shocking images of slaughterhouses. "Cedarwood doesn't need scavengers like you." One morning in particular, Ethan arrived at the store before dawn to find the window spray-painted with red. "Meat is murder." He stood still for a few seconds, holding a bucket and a wire brush, watching the reflection of himself in the vandalized glass. Martha arrived soon after, bringing coffee in a thermos cup. "Again?" she sighed, looking at the paint running like blood. "These idiots have nothing else to do?" "Never mind, Martha. I'll handle it," Ethan replied, trying to hide his frustration. The protests were more than a nuisance. They were driving away the few loyal customers who still shopped there. During a particularly busy Saturday, Kyle and his group stormed the store's parking lot, shouting with bullhorns and pushing flyers at customers as they entered. Ethan, already on edge, left the store and confronted Kyle. "You guys have done enough for today. Go away," Ethan said, remaining calm as he held onto his blood-stained apron. "Do you think we will stop?" Kyle retorted with a challenging smile. "People need to know what you do here." The tension was palpable, but Ethan knew that losing his temper would only give the group more ammunition. He walked back into the store, feeling Kyle's eyes burning into his back. That night, as Ethan and Martha closed the store, they found the car's tires deflated. It was a clear provocation, and they were both exhausted. "This has to stop," said Martha, in a firm voice that Ethan rarely heard. The parking lot behind Bennett's Butcher Shop was shrouded in an unsettling gloom. Streetlights flickered every now and then, casting flickering shadows on the brick walls. Ethan and Martha, tired and frustrated, were changing the tire on their vandalized car when they heard rapid footsteps echoing across the asphalt. "Did you think you were going to get rid of me so easily?" Kyle Roberts' voice cut through the silence, full of sarcasm and contempt. He emerged from the shadows with a cell phone in his hand, apparently recording. "That's enough, Kyle," Ethan said, slowly straightening up. His tone was firm but controlled. "You've done enough for one night. Go home." "Oh, sure," Kyle scoffed, raising his cell phone like a weapon. "And let you continue this carnage? I don't think so. Tomorrow everyone will see this." Martha crossed her arms, trying to hide the uneasiness she felt. "You've already destroyed our store, our sales. What more do you want?" "I want you to close the doors for good," Kyle replied, approaching. "And if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of people you are." "Enough of this," Ethan snapped, taking a step forward. He didn't want violence, but the tension that had built up over months finally boiled over. "You don't know anything about us. This is my family's livelihood, and you come here as if you own the truth." Kyle laughed mockingly. Support? You kill living beings and call it sustenance. What a joke. Ethan took another step forward, now face to face with Kyle. I said go away. It was at that moment that everything got out of control. Martha tried to intervene. Please, do not do that. It's not worth it. Kyle ignored Martha and advanced directly toward Ethan. And what are you going to do? Hit me? This will look great in the video. Aggressor butcher attacks activist. Kyle smiled sideways, but this time without mockery. It was a smile of defiance, a warning that he would not back down. Then, in a quick and unexpected movement, Kyle punched Ethan in the face. The impact was strong. Ethan stumbled back, clutching the left side of his face where the blow had hit him. Martha shouted, "Kyle, stop it!" But Kyle didn't stop. "Is that what you got, old man? Is that all?" He moved forward again, ready for another blow, but Ethan, still dizzy, raised his hand, trying to push him away. "He arrives!" Ethan shouted, returning to fight back. He grabbed Kyle by the shirt and pushed him hard against the side of the car. The metallic sound echoed through the empty parking lot. Kyle reacted immediately, pushing Ethan with both hands. "You're not as tough as you look," he shouted, furious. Ethan stumbled but stayed on his feet. "I told you to stop." Kyle tried to move forward once more, but in the heat of the moment, he didn't notice the puddle of oil spreading across the floor. His foot suddenly slipped and he lost his balance. Everything happened in seconds. Kyle fell backwards. The impact of his head against the metal rim of a trash drum was sharp and frightening. The silence that followed was deafening. Martha ran up to Ethan, grabbing his arm. "Ethan, my God, he's not moving." Ethan, still panting and with a pained face, looked at Kyle, who lay motionless on the floor. He approached slowly, crouching down beside the body. He touched the activist's neck, looking for a pulse, but found nothing. "Ethan, what are we going to do?" Martha whispered, her eyes wide and glistening with tears that threatened to fall. Ethan stood, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. "It was an accident. He slipped. We didn't do anything wrong." "Do you think they'll believe that?" Martha snapped, the desperation in her voice growing. "They'll think we did it on purpose. Ethan, this could destroy us." Ethan looked around, trying to think quickly. "No one saw it. Nobody knows he was here. So, what are you saying?" Martha asked, almost afraid of the answer. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then met her eyes. "We can't call the police. If they show up, our life is over. We need to resolve this ourselves. We're going to put him in the store's freezer, at least until we decide what to do." Martha covered her mouth with her hand, horrified. "Ethan, this is crazy!" But there was no other option. If they called the police, the story they had to tell would sound absurd. Who would believe Kyle's death was an accident? He was a well-known activist in the city with many supporters, and they were already seen as villains. The two knelt beside the body. Ethan, trying to avoid looking directly at Kyle's limp face, grabbed his arms while Martha grabbed his ankles. The feeling of carrying that dead weight was something they would never forget. "My God, he's heavier than he looks," said Martha, her voice cracking with exertion. "Hold on tight," Ethan replied, looking toward the back door of the store. "Let's go quickly." They opened the door, and the sound of the empty store enveloped them, as if the space was aware of the secret it was about to keep. They passed through the narrow hallway that led to the freezer, their footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. When they reached the large stainless steel freezer, Ethan let go of Kyle's arms to open the heavy door. The icy air escaped, enveloping the couple in a white fog that seemed even denser at that moment. "There," Ethan said, panting. "Now, lift up a little more. Let's put it on the bottom shelf." The two lifted their bodies with difficulty, trying not to look at the pale, motionless face. When they finally placed him inside the freezer, Ethan closed the door with a bang that seemed to seal not only Kyle's body, but also the fate of the Bennetts. Martha leaned back against the wall, panting and her hands shaking. This doesn't feel real." "It's real," Ethan replied, turning to her with a dark look. "And now we have to live with it. What if someone asks for him? He's known around town, Ethan. People will notice he's gone," said Martha, trying to keep her voice steady but failing. "Then we need to be careful," Ethan replied, crossing his arms. "We can't change anything in our routine. We can't look nervous or act different. And above all, no one goes into that freezer. Never." Martha swallowed hard but nodded. "All good, but—" "And then, what do we do next?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just looked at the freezer door, as if he was contemplating all the consequences of that night. Later, we'll think about later when the time comes. The next day, the sun rose over Cedarwood, casting a soft, cold light on the empty streets. Ethan and Martha woke up feeling like the night before was nothing more than a nightmare. But when they opened their eyes, reality hit them again. Kyle's body was there, hidden in the freezer, and the life they knew would never be the same. There was still an uneasiness in their hearts. Ethan's mind, always rational, couldn't shake the fear. Martha, on the other hand, seemed in a state of emotional paralysis, trying every second to find a way to deal with the weight of that situation. But when the two arrived at the store, they realized that, at least at that moment, they were alone. There were no signs that anyone had noticed anything out of the ordinary. The parking lot was empty, and the street, as always, went unnoticed. The silence in the store was uncomfortable, and the familiar smell of fresh meat did nothing to calm the couple's nerves. They knew they needed to make a quick decision. The police could not be called. The security cameras recorded nothing, and the city was at a slow pace, with no witnesses present. But even so, there was something that made them feel that the worst was yet to come. After a few hours of tension and silence, an idea emerged. Although it was far from ideal, it seemed like the only possible way out. Preparing Kyle's meat and serving it to customers would not only dispose of the body, but also give them a chance to continue the business. It was a macabre solution, without a doubt, but a solution. They looked at each other for a moment, as if silently asking for permission to take the step they knew was irreversible. Martha, with shaking hands, began to cut the meat mechanically, while Ethan organized the seasonings and prepared the portions. The feeling of repulsion and horror invaded them with each movement, but they both knew it was necessary. They needed to dispose of the body without a trace, and there was no more time to hesitate. As Kyle's meat was prepared, the two tried to push away the disturbing thoughts, focusing only on the work in front of them. The aroma of meat being cooked began to fill the room. Throughout the day, the store remained surprisingly quiet, devoid of customers, until later a man entered, attracted by the unmistakable smell. The customer, a regular at the store, commented admiringly on the quality of the meat. "It's different today," he said, taking a piece of the grilled meat. "I've never tasted anything so good here." Ethan and Martha exchanged quick glances, and not knowing how to react, smiled nervously. As the day progressed, more and more customers entered the store, attracted by the unusual flavor and succulent texture of the meat. Sales began to soar. People lined up, commenting on how amazing the meat was, something they had never tried before. The flow of customers increased every hour, and the feeling of success began to take over the couple. As the days passed, the success of Bennett's butcher shop seemed to have no limits. The meat of Kyle Roberts, the activist who had been fatally injured in the fight, had quickly sold out, and customers were clamoring for more. Demand was high, and the store, which had previously been on the verge of bankruptcy, was now thriving in an unthinkable way. However, the couple knew that to keep the fresh meat flowing, they needed more. Ethan and Martha were increasingly immersed in this new world, where morality had been set aside in the name of survival and financial success. They started to become bolder, more confident, since the police hadn't come after them for Kyle's death, probably because no one had suspected anything. The couple felt safe enough to take the next step. They knew where activists gathered, their secret meeting points, the places where they organized protests and demonstrations. At night, when the city fell silent, Ethan and Martha prepared to ambush those they previously considered enemies of their business. With almost clinical precision, they hunted their victims, always on the move, without leaving a trace. Each new ambush became more cold and calculating. The couple no longer felt remorse. There was no more room for guilt or regret. The only thought that dominated them was the need to maintain the store's success. The smell of the meat being prepared, the sparkle in the eyes of satisfied customers, the satisfaction of seeing sales rising every day, all of this eclipsed any trace of humanity that still remained in them. They were like predators on a relentless hunt, acting quickly, always with the same routine: kidnap the activists, take them to the store, and prepare them as they would any other meat. There was no more hesitation. Increasingly, bodies disappeared into the freezer, and the cycle began again. The meat was cut, seasoned, sold and consumed, while the couple maintained their impeccable facade, with no one suspecting what was really happening behind the scenes. As time passed, the feeling of impunity intensified. Sales continued to grow, and the couple felt increasingly secure, believing that the police would never find them. But they were wrong. Ethan was behind the counter preparing a new batch of meat when the store door opened with the distinctive sound of a bell announcing the arrival of a customer. He was a man of medium height, with a serious expression and penetrating eyes. He walked in leisurely, looking around as if trying to familiarize himself with his surroundings. His name was Jack Turner, a friend of Kyle Roberts, the activist who had disappeared months ago. Jack didn't believe the stories about his friend and was determined to find out the truth. He began asking questions that at first seemed harmless but soon became unsettling. Jack looked at the display cases, observing the meats on display before approaching the counter where Ethan was working. "You know, the meat here has a peculiar flavor. I've come here a few times, and I always thought it was something with the seasonings. But now, I don't know, it seems different." Ethan, a little uncomfortable, tried to hide his reaction, forcing a smile as he wiped his hands on the towel. "Well, you know, every cut has its own flavor, Jack. We strive to offer the best. Nothing weird, if you ask me." Jack remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the meat. But it wasn't just the meat that worried him. He had heard the rumors, the whispered conversations of those who had come to the store, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I know Kyle was bothering you," said Jack. "Him and the other activists. He told me many times how this store wasn't right, how you treated animals. I didn't know he was gone until after a while, but now, which I think makes sense. There aren't many traces, right? And well, the fact that your store has improved so much." Ethan swallowed hard, the smile fading from his face. He knew the situation was getting dangerous. Jack was getting closer to something, and he didn't know how much the man knew or suspected. "Look, we've always done our job. We've never done anything wrong. These activists, they have their ideas. But everyone here knows that our store serves the best meat in town. That's it. There's no mystery, Jack." Jack didn't look convinced. He moved a little closer, eyes still fixed on Ethan, trying to read his reactions. The tension in the air was palpable. "I understand. But it's curious, isn't it, how things changed so quickly. Business was going bad, and suddenly you have customers coming from everywhere. The meat tastes peculiar. I heard that some of our friends, the activists, were worried about what was happening here, but no one ever thought it was something so big or so macabre." Ethan tried to remain calm, but the pressure was starting to take a toll. He knew that if Jack was more persistent, things could start to fall apart. He forced himself to smile again, trying to divert the attention. "I don't know what you're talking about, Jack. We've got nothing to hide. Our business is going well, that's all. I'm just a butcher, man. Now, if you want to take something, we have a special cut today. Very juicy, great for a family dinner." Jack was still looking at him, his gaze piercing, but he didn't say anything else for a moment. He knew something was wrong, but he still didn't have the proof. He sighed and turned towards the door. "Maybe you're right, Ethan. I don't know. I'll keep an eye out. But if you know anything, if you know what happened to Kyle and the others, you'd better tell me." Ethan was silent. As Jack left the store, the sound of the door closing behind him, he leaned against the counter, feeling the tension take over his body. Jack couldn't get the feeling of discomfort out of his head. The meat shop, Ethan's forced smiles, and the growing popularity of the business all seemed to fit together in a strange way. The meat had a peculiar taste, something he couldn't identify. But what bothered him most were the disappearances of the activists, the lack of answers, the rumors circulating around town, and the way Bennett's store was thriving in an almost inexplicable way, all led him to a single conclusion. He needed to investigate deeper. That night, Jack decided he would look for answers. He knew where to start. In the city records office, stored in rusty boxes and filing cabinets, were the clues he needed. With the key he had gotten from an old friend at the police station, he entered the empty, silent building, the dim lights illuminating the way as he passed through the dusty hallways. The smell of old paper and mildew was unmistakable, but Jack was determined. He went to the records room and, with the help of a flashlight, began leafing through the files. The names of several activists began to appear on the pages, each with details about their disappearances. Most investigations pointed to nothing more than guesswork, but some information caught his attention. He picked up a specific notebook that contained reports on the most recent cases, and there it was, the name of Kyle Roberts and other activists who had disappeared in recent weeks. As he combed through the records, something began to stand out. All of the disappearances had occurred near Bennett's butcher shop. He frowned, looking again at the details, and that's when he realized it wasn't a coincidence. In one case after another, the last tracks of each activist indicated that they had been near the store, or in some cases, inside it. Some people's testimonies mentioned having seen the activists arguing with the owners, Ethan and Martha Bennett, shortly before they disappeared. Jack sat for a moment, taking in the information, and the idea formed in his mind with frightening clarity. He went to a file that contained details about the sale of meat in the city. The butcher shop receipts were there, and Jack couldn't help but notice a significant increase in meat sales at Bennett's butcher shop in the weeks following the disappearances. Not only that, but people were talking more about the store, and the rumor that the meat was different started to spread. A more intense flavor, something unusual. Tension built in his mind as he connected the dots. The disappearances, the sudden improvement in business, the whispers about the peculiar meat. It was all starting to make sense. Jack knew there was something rotten behind all of this, but there was still one fundamental piece missing. What had happened to the bodies? Where were the missing people? He continued his search through the records and found a note that made him stop. An application for permission to store large quantities of meat in a commercial freezer at Bennett's butcher shop, filed in the name of Ethan Bennett. The weight of the truth began to fall on him. Jack stood up, the feeling of revulsion intensifying. Now, the truth was clear in his mind. Ethan and Martha Bennett were involved in something far more sinister than simple butchery business. They were killing, and he had no doubt that the victims were the activists themselves who had disappeared. Jack's breathing quickened as he put away the records, his thoughts in a whirlwind. He knew he needed to act quickly. The pieces were falling into place, and with every second, the reality of the situation grew scarier. The Bennetts weren't just butchers, they were killers. Jack could no longer ignore the truth. He felt the weight of the information in his hands, as if the records he had found were burning in his fingers. With the papers neatly tucked away in his briefcase, Jack headed towards the police station building, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. The building was quiet that night, with few officers present, but Jack knew what he was about to do would change everything. He entered the investigation room, where two police officers were chatting casually. When he entered, the officers' gazes turned to him, curious. Jack wasted no time. He placed the records on the table, a serious expression on his face. "I found something you need to see," he said, his voice firm. "These records contain all the evidence that shows that Ethan and Martha Bennett are involved in the disappearances of several activists. They are killing people and selling the flesh." The police officers exchanged skeptical looks, as if they were listening to a fictional story. The oldest, a man with grey hair and a tired face, looked at Jack suspiciously. "Are you sure what you're saying, Jack? That's a very serious accusation." "Look at the records," Jack replied, pushing the stack of papers toward them. "All of the missing activists were near their store. I found permission to store meat in their commercial freezer, and sales soared after the disappearances. This is no coincidence." The younger officer took the papers, flipping through them quickly, and his eyes began to widen as he read. He raised his head, visibly shocked but also suspicious. "This is very serious, Jack, but we can't act without a court order. We'll need more evidence to search their store." Jack knew he was in a race against time. "I couldn't wait any longer. I know it seems unlikely, but the records are there. Believe what you're seeing. Their store is where it all started, and now it's clear what's going on." The older officer looked at the younger one, who shook his head, already convinced that something wasn't right. After a few seconds of silence, the older officer sighed and picked up his phone. "I'll get a court order. We'll investigate." Within days, the police got the authorization they needed. Tension hung in the air. Jack, although relieved to finally see the investigation gain traction, couldn't shake the feeling that something could go wrong. He had been summoned to accompany the police in the operation. With court authorization in hand, they headed to Bennett's butcher shop with a clear objective: to find the evidence that Jack knew was hidden in the depths of the butcher shop's freezer. The sound of police officers' footsteps echoed in the silent street as they approached the store. Jack was in the lead, his gaze fixed on the familiar facade that now seemed different, charged with a new sense of danger. He knew that if this was confirmed, everything would change forever. "Mr. Bennett, we would like to speak with you. Close the store for a moment, please. We are conducting an investigation," the officer said. Ethan, visibly surprised, tried to maintain his composure. He smiled nervously at the customer and indicated that the store would be closed for a few minutes. Of course. Just a moment, please," Ethan said. He asked customers to leave quickly, something that would never happen on a normal day, but customers, uncomfortable with the police presence, complied without question. As soon as the last person left the store, the door closed with a dry sound, and the room was filled with an oppressive stillness. "Mr. Bennett, we have a court order to search your store. We believe there is evidence relating to several disappearances. We need to take a look at your records and everything inside your store." Ethan felt his stomach tighten, but he tried to hide it, forcing a smile as he walked away from the counter. "Of course, officer, I don't know what you're talking about, but feel free." He watched them as the officers began to search the store, examining the place meticulously. Jack stood silently, watching every move, knowing he was close to seeing justice done, but also aware that everything he had feared was about to be revealed. The police went to the freezer. When the eldest opened the door with a bang, the cold, fetid air that emanated from inside was the first clear sign that something was very wrong. The dim light from the room illuminated the bodies stacked inside the freezer, wrapped in plastic and packaging. Some were in pieces, others with their flesh still visible, but all were unmistakably human. The shock was immediate. "My God, that's not possible." The younger, pale-faced police officer stepped back, clearly affected by the grotesque scene before him. I can't believe what I'm seeing." Jack, who had been silent until then, approached the freezer door. He felt a knot in his stomach, but the feeling of justice was beginning to grow inside him. What he had suspected was there, before his eyes, in a scene of indescribable horror. Ethan was frozen, his face pale as a ghost. He tried to open his mouth, but no words came out. His body was tense, and the look of terror in his eyes could not be disguised. He knew there was no escape now. Everything was exposed. When Martha arrived at the store that afternoon, she had no idea what awaited her. She parked her car in front of Bennett's butcher shop and walked to the door, the cold city wind hitting her face. As he entered, a chill ran down his spine. She saw Ethan, still paralyzed, being handcuffed by police officers. His gaze was blank, as if he was trying to process the reality that was unfolding before him. Martha swallowed hard. Her feet began to wobble, and she lay still for a moment. The sight of the open freezer, with the bodies being removed, made his stomach turn. What's going on here?" Martha said. The police did not respond immediately, focusing on removing the bodies from the freezer and placing them in black bags. The sight of so many lives stolen was a brutal blow to Martha, who felt a wave of panic take over her body. She looked at Ethan, but he didn't react. He was in shock, unable to look at her. She advanced towards him, but one of the police officers quickly stopped her. "Stay where you are, Mrs. Bennett." Martha looked around, her gaze passing over the bodies and then back to the police officers, her face pale and her heart racing. She didn't know what to say. She swallowed hard and turned to Ethan desperately, her voice breaking. "Ethan, what are we going to do? What happened?" Ethan looked at her with empty eyes, as if she were a stranger. There were no more words to explain. There was no way to justify what they had done. The silence that hovered between them was heavy, as if both knew that the consequences were now irreversible. "Mrs. Bennett, we are holding you both for murder and concealment of bodies." Martha began to tremble. Tears began to run down her face, but she knew it was too late to regret, which began as a desperate act of survival, now had consumed it completely. She looked at her still handcuffed husband and felt a deep pain in her chest. They had gone too far, and now they were paying the price. The police continued to remove the bodies from the freezer, while the reality of what they had done was beginning to establish themselves. The store, which was once the center of their lives, was now being transformed into a crime, and all that was left to the couple was the weight of guilt and inevitability of what would come next. With the bodies finally removed, the police began to take Ethan and Martha out of the store. Their hands were handcuffed, and while the two were taken to the car, the city, which once admired them, now saw them as monsters. The headlines of the newspapers did not give respite. Solidated disappearances, the horror behind Bennett's butcher shop. Each page turned was a memory of what the city had become. The scandal that exposed the true face of Ethan and Martha Bennett. Appearances, as seen, are always misleading. Behind a normal facade, where a simple butcher shop became the center of a flourishing business, were the monsters that society chose to ignore. Ethan and Martha Bennett were not dark figures, nor those with obvious behavior of villains. They were ordinary people who took advantage of the vulnerability of a moment to feed their own dark desires. What happened there is a reminder that monsters may be closer than we think, hidden under the masks of people who mingle with the crowd, appearing to be harmless. Sometimes evil has no face, but a cover that deceives. And even the most common can be able to commit the greatest horrors. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Here you find stories that bring a deep reflection every day, and I'm sure the story that is appearing on the screen now will delight you too. Don't miss it.